On a Wednesday morning in October, Thomas Greer paid $60 for a violin at an estate sale and carried it home in a paper grocery bag because the case had fallen apart at the hinges. His sister-in-law Renee was standing in his driveway when he pulled up. She looked at the bag, looked at him, and said, "Please tell me that's not what I think it is." Thomas set it on the hood of his truck and unwrapped it carefully. Renee made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Tom, you can barely keep the lights on." He didn't answer her. He carried the violin inside. 11 days later, a woman named Sylvia Crane, who ran acquisitions for the Harrington Collection in New York, drove 4 hours to stand in Thomas's kitchen and offer him $400,000 for it. He asked her to come back the next morning. She did. Thomas Greer was 51 years old, and he had the kind of hands that told a story before he opened his mouth, deck at the knuckle, stained faintly with linseed oil that no amount of scrubbing fully removed, with 2 fingers on the left hand that had healed crooked after a workshop accident 12 years earlier. He had spent the last 23 years repairing and restoring stringed instruments out of a converted detached garage behind his house on Finnick Road in Dunmore, Pennsylvania. Not performing. Not recording. Fixing. His wife, Carol, had died 3 winters ago from a cancer that moved faster than anyone had prepared for. They had been together since they were both 22, which meant Thomas had spent more of his life with her than without her. And the arithmetic of that did not become easier as time passed. She had played cello. Not professionally, but seriously, the way some people approach a thing they love without needing an audience for it. She had practiced on Tuesday and Thursday evenings in the room off the hallway that they had always called the music room, even though it also contained the ironing board and a broken treadmill. After she died, Thomas left the cello on its stand in the corner of that room. He didn't move it, and he didn't play it. He just left it there the way you leave a light on in a room you're not ready to close. His son, Aaron, was 17, quiet in the way of teenagers who are processing more than they show, and deeply interested in football in a way that mystified Thomas, but that he supported completely and without reservation. Aaron had his mother's eyes and his father's hands, and a tendency to sit in the workshop on weekend afternoons without doing anything in particular, just being nearby, which Thomas understood as its own kind of conversation. Renee Calloway was Carol's younger sister. She was 44, worked in real estate, and had a way of entering a room as though she had already assessed it and found it wanting. She was not a malicious person. She was a practical one, which in certain moments amounted to the same thing. She had been in Thomas's life for 29 years, and she meant well in the way that people mean well when they have decided that meaning well exempts them from considering how a thing will land. She had been stopping by more frequently since Carol died, which Thomas understood and did not resent, but she had also developed, in those 3 years, a habit of looking at his house, his workshop, his choices, with an expression that said she was calculating something she hadn't been asked to calculate. The estate sale was on Clement Street, 2 miles from Thomas's house. On a Tuesday evening in early October, he had gone because a neighbor mentioned it, and because the listing had included the phrase, "miscellaneous musical instruments, condition unknown," which was the sort of phrase that functioned for Thomas the way a fishing hook functions for a fish. He had not expected much. Estate sale instruments were usually student models, mass-produced, sometimes charming, rarely significant. He walked through the house for 20 minutes without finding anything he would have crossed the street for. A recorder. A student guitar with a cracked top. A keyboard missing 7 keys. He was heading toward the exit when he noticed the bag. It was sitting on a folding table in the back corner of what had been the dining room, half hidden behind a box of National Geographic magazines. A brown paper grocery bag, folded down at the top, with a piece of masking tape on the side that read, "Violin, $60. He opened the bag and unwrapped the cloth inside. The instrument was in poor condition. The varnish was clouded and worn through entirely in places. The tailpiece was cracked. 1 tuning peg was missing and had been replaced badly with something that didn't fit the peg box correctly. The top had a repaired crack running from the upper bout toward the F-hole, an old repair done with hide glue that had yellowed over decades, but Thomas stood there with the violin in his hands and did not put it back down. The arching was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of poor craftsmanship. Wrong in the sense of not belonging to any template he recognized. The curve of the top plate was unusually pronounced, almost aggressive. the kind of arch associated with certain older Italian and German traditions that had largely fallen out of fashion by the 19th century. The fee-holes were cut with a precision that did not match the general state of the instrument. Someone had done this work by hand with complete confidence. He turned it over. The back was one piece, which was not unusual, but the figure in the maple was extraordinary. A deep, tight flame that ran consistently from edge to edge, the kind of wood that maker selected carefully and did not waste on student instruments. He looked at it for a long time in the bad lighting of that dining room. Then he paid $60 and wrapped it back up in the cloth and carried it home in the grocery bag. Renee had been dropping something off, a casserole dish she'd borrowed 2 months ago. When he pulled into the driveway, she looked at the bag and Thomas watched her work through it. The paper grocery bag, the shape of it, the fact that he was holding it with the same careful attention he gave things he considered important. Please tell me that's not what I think it is. He unwrapped the top of the bag enough to show her. She made her sound. She said the thing about the lights. He didn't answer her because he didn't have an answer that would translate, and because, on some level, he understood that this was not actually about the violin. That night, after Aaron had gone to bed, Thomas set up his best work light on the bench in the workshop and examined the instrument properly for the first time. He spent 4 hours with it. He used a mirror and a flashlight to look inside the body and found the label, which he had expected to be either missing or illegible. It was neither. It was in typed, handwritten in brown ink, faded but readable, the name of a maker, a city, and a date. The city was Mittenwald. The date was 1771. He photographed the label. He photographed the arching, the F-holes, the scroll, the back, the rib construction at the corners. He took 27 photographs in total and then sat down on a stool and looked at the instrument under the work light without touching it. A Mittenwald violin from 1771 could be many things. It could be a competent workshop instrument worth a few $1,000s. It could be something made by one of the significant makers working in that town during that period, in which case the range widened considerably. It could also be something that a label claimed it was and wasn't, which was true of a significant percentage of labeled instruments. He didn't sleep much. He went inside at 2 in the morning and lay on his back in the dark for a while. Then got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. He thought about the arching. He thought about the folds. He thought about the quality of the wood on the back. He sent a message to a colleague named Walter False, who had worked as an instrument authenticator for a major auction house in Boston for 30 years before retiring to Vermont. Thomas and Walter had met at a restoration conference in Philadelphia 18 years ago and had maintained the kind of friendship that consisted largely of occasional emails and annual phone calls, but that was genuine in its own unhurried way. The message said, "Walter, found something strange. Need your eyes on photographs. Can you call tomorrow?" Walter replied at 6:45 in the morning. "Already up. Send the photos first." Thomas sent the photos. He waited. 34 minutes passed. Then his phone rang. Walter said, "Where did you find this?" Thomas told him. There was a pause that lasted long enough to have weight. "The label," Walter said. "Do you recognize the name?" Thomas said he didn't. Most people won't. He was not prolific. He made perhaps 40 instruments that are documented. There may be others. He worked in Mittenwald for about 16 years and then disappears from the records entirely in the mid-1780s. His instruments have appeared at auction 4 times in the last 30 years. The last one sold for $280,000. That was in 2019. Thomas looked at the violin on his workbench. "Walter, I know. I paid $60 for it at an estate sale." "I understand that, Tom. I need you to listen to me carefully. Don't tell anyone about this yet. Not until we can get a proper assessment. I know someone who can be there within a week. His name is Hendricks. He's the best authenticator working in this country right now. I'll call him today." Thomas thanked him and hung up. He sat in the workshop for a while without doing anything. Then he picked up the violin, tuned it as well as the missing peg allowed, rosined an old bow that had been sitting in a drawer, and played a single long note on the G string. The sound was unlike anything that should have come out of an instrument in that condition. It was deep and complex and slightly rough around the edges from age and neglect. But underneath the roughness, there was a quality of resonance that Thomas recognized without being able to name it, the way you recognize a voice you haven't heard in 20 years. He lowered the bow. He sat for a moment. He thought, without intending to, about Carol. She had always said that the difference between a good instrument and a great one was not something you heard, it was something you felt in your hands when you played it, a kind of conversation the instrument was having with you underneath the sound. He had never fully believed her. He believed her now. He covered the violin with a cloth and went inside to make breakfast before Aaron woke up. Renee called that afternoon. She had mentioned the violin to someone, which Thomas had expected and had not asked her not to do because he had not yet thought to. The someone was a musician friend who had laughed about it, which Renee relayed in the tone that was meant to be sympathetic, but landed as something else. He said if it was actually worth anything, it wouldn't have ended up in a paper bag at an estate sale for $60. Thomas said, "That's probably right most of the time. Tom, I'm just saying. You have enough things to worry about without chasing, Renee." He kept his voice level. "I appreciate you calling." He put the phone down without hanging up angrily, which took some effort. Aaron asked about the violin at dinner. Thomas had not told him yet, so Aaron had heard something from somewhere, which told Thomas that the information was already moving in the way that information moves in a small town, faster than its subject. "Is it old?" Aaron asked. "Probably. Like old? Possibly." Aaron turned this over. He was 17 and he understood when to push and when not to. "Do you think it's worth something?" Thomas thought about what to say. He said, "I don't know yet. Maybe." Aaron nodded. He ate his food. Then, without looking up, he said, "Mom would have wanted to hear it." Thomas put his fork down. He sat with that for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." The week that followed was one of the stranger weeks of Thomas's adult life. He continued working in the shop, taking in the regular repairs, a bowed end pin, a cracked bridge, a bow that needed rehairing, because the work was the work and it didn't stop, because something unusual had happened. But there was a quality to that week of operating on two tracks simultaneously, one familiar and one that felt borrowed from a different kind of life. Walter's contact, a man named Philip Hendricks, arrived on a Thursday morning. He was 63, compact and deliberate in his movements, and he brought with him a leather case that contained, among other things, an inspection light, a set of precision calipers, a loop, and a notebook in which he wrote exclusively in pencil. He spent 3.5 hours with the violin. He did not speak during this time except to occasionally ask Thomas a question about the physical condition of something he was examining. When he finished, he sat down on the stool across from Thomas's bench and was quiet for a moment. "The label is consistent with the period," he said. "The construction methods are consistent with the identified work of this maker. The wood on the back is consistent with timber sourced from that region in that era, based on the grain density and the nature of the figure." He paused. "The arching is the most distinctive element. It's characteristic. I've examined 2 other instruments attributed to this maker, and the arch profile is unusual in the same specific way across all 3. He looked at Thomas steadily. "I can't give you a definitive attribution in this room. That requires laboratory dendrochronology and a comparative analysis with documented examples. But I want to be honest with you about where I am after 3 hours with this instrument." Thomas waited. "I believe this is genuine," Hendricks said. "I believe the label is accurate, and I believe this is possibly the finest example of this maker's work that I have encountered." The room was quiet for a moment. Thomas said, "What does that mean in terms of value?" Hendricks set down his notebook. At a major auction house with proper documentation and provenance research, an instrument like this would likely open at $300,000 and could go considerably higher depending on who is in the room. There is a private collector in Europe who has been looking for an instrument by this maker for 8 years. There are 2 American institutions I'm aware of that would consider acquisition at the right price. He paused. "You should speak with someone at one of the major houses. I can make an introduction if you'd like." Thomas thanked him. After Hendricks left, he sat in the workshop for a long time without doing anything in particular. Aaron came in from school and sat on the old chair in the corner, the one with the cracked armrest that had been there since before Aaron was born. He didn't ask anything. He just sat there, the way he did, and Thomas found that he was grateful for it. What Thomas did not know was that Hendricks had called Walter from the road before he reached the highway, and Walter, who was not a man given to excitement, had said, "Good God," when Hendricks told him what he thought. Walter then called his wife to tell her, and his wife called her sister who happened to know someone who knew someone in the regional music community in northeastern Pennsylvania, And by the following morning the story had found its way, in a version that was approximately true in its broad outline, to several people who were not Thomas Greer. Renee heard it from a colleague over lunch on Friday. The version she heard said the violin was worth millions, which was a rounding up that the story had acquired somewhere in transit. She sat at her kitchen table that evening and opened her laptop and searched the maker's name that she had written on a napkin. She found what there was to find, which was not much, because this maker was not famous in the way that Stradivari or Guarneri were famous. But she found a record of the 2019 auction, and she found the sale price, and she sat looking at her screen for a long time. She knocked on Thomas's door on Saturday morning without calling first. She had brought coffee, 2 cups from the place on Main Street that he liked. Thomas opened the door and looked at the cups and then at her face. She said, "I owe you something." He stepped back from the door to let her in. They sat at the kitchen table. She told him she had repeated what the musician friend said and she was sorry for it. She told him she had Googled the maker's name and she understood now, at least partly, what he might have been holding in that paper bag, and she was sorry for the comment about the lights. Thomas listened. He said, "It's all right, Renee." She looked at the table. "I do that. I see you struggling with something and I try to be practical and it comes out wrong. You were looking out for me." "I was. But not the right way." She looked up. Carol would have known immediately, wouldn't she, what that violin was? Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Probably before I did," he said. Renee nodded. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "She would have made you play it for her right there in the estate sale living room." Thomas almost smiled. "She would have embarrassed the hell out of me." They sat with that for a while, which was the most comfortable they had been together in 3 years. The call from Sylvia Crane came on a Monday evening. She introduced herself as the director of acquisitions for the Harrington Collection, a private institution in New York with a focus on early European stringed instruments. She said that Philip Hendricks had reached out with a preliminary report and that the collection had a significant interest. She spoke carefully and professionally and said she would like to visit in person if Thomas was open to a conversation. She mentioned a figure, preliminary and subject to formal appraisal, of $400,000. Thomas said he would need to think. She said she understood completely and asked if she could call the following morning. He said yes. Then he hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Aaron was doing homework at the table. He looked up. Who was that? Someone from New York. About the violin. Aaron waited. She offered $400,000 for it. Aaron's pencil stopped moving. He looked at his father for a long moment. "What did you say?" "I told her I needed to think." Aaron looked back at his homework. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's there to think about?" Thomas sat down across from him. "I don't know yet." Aaron turned his pencil over in his hand. He said, without looking up, "It's just a thing, Dad. It's not her. It was never her." Thomas looked at his son. Aaron was 17 years old and he said things sometimes that arrived with more weight than the words themselves could account for. "I know that," Thomas said. "So sell it," Aaron said, "and do something good with it." That's what she would have said. Thomas went out to the workshop after Aaron went to bed. He sat on his stool in the dark for a while before he turned the light on. He took the cloth off the violin and looked at it under the work light. He thought about the man who had made this instrument in a small German town in 1771, who had spent weeks or months on the arching alone, who had selected the wood with the attention of someone who understood that this object would outlive him by centuries. He thought about the estate sale, the paper bag, the $60, the bad lighting in that dining room, and the thing in the arching that had made him stop. He thought about Carol. He thought about what she would have said, not in some imagined version of the conversation, but specifically in her voice, which he could still hear exactly when he chose to. She would have said, "Tom, it's not about what it's worth. It's about what you do next with what you have." He picked up the old bow and rosined it again. He tuned the violin as well as it could be tuned with the mismatched peg and played. Very quietly, the opening phrase of a Bach partita that Carol had played on the cello so many times in the room off the hallway that he knew every note of it without having been taught. It sounded, in that quiet garage on a Monday night in October, like something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. He set the bow down. He covered the violin. He went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote a list of 3 things. The first was the number for the Harrington collection. The second was the name of Carol's oncologist research fund, which had been soliciting donations for a clinical trial that Carol had wanted to support before she got sick. The fund had stalled for 2 years from what Thomas had read, $40,000 short of its target. The third was Aaron's college savings account, which contained, at that moment, $11,000. He looked at the list for a while. Sylvia Crane arrived the next morning in a dark blue sedan. She was in her early 50s, precise and unhurried, and she brought with her a formal written offer on Harrington collection letterhead. The number was $400,000. Below it was a clause that said, the collection intended to display the instrument in their permanent gallery, available to the public and to scholars and to students of instrument-making history, fully documented and attributed. Thomas read the document at his kitchen table with Sylvia across from him. Aaron had already left for school. The workshop was quiet through the window. He asked one question. The attribution on the display. It will say where it was found. Sylvia said yes. It would say the instrument had been in private hands for an unknown period before being acquired at an estate sale in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, and identified by Thomas Greer, an instrument restorer, who recognized its significance from its construction. Thomas asked if she could add something. She said she would try. He said he would like the display to note that the violin had been played in a garage in Dunmore on a Monday evening in October, once, before it went anywhere, by the man who found it, and that the person who would have most wanted to hear it could not be there to listen. He said it didn't have to be those exact words. He said it just had to be honest about the fact that there are people behind every object that makes it into a museum, people who loved it before anyone else knew it was worth loving. Sylvia looked at him for a moment. She wrote something in her notebook. She said, "I'll make sure of it." He signed the document that afternoon. The money cleared 3 weeks later. The first transfer he made was to the Oncology Research Fund. The exact amount they were short of their target. He did it from his phone, sitting in the driveway in his truck. And when the confirmation came through, he sat there for a few minutes with the phone in his hand and didn't go inside right away. He put the rest in Aaron's college fund and in a separate account he labeled, in the banking app, simply Workshop. He expanded the garage. He bought a second set of proper work lights. He took on an apprentice, a 23-year-old named Cole who had emailed him 6 months earlier asking to learn and whom Thomas had turned down twice for lack of space and now called back. He did not become a different person. He continued to wake early and to take in the ordinary repairs and to eat dinner at the kitchen table with Aaron on the nights Aaron wasn't at practice. He kept the cello on its stand in the room off the hallway. He still didn't play it, but sometimes in the evenings he went and stood in the doorway of that room for a moment. Not to do anything, just to be near it. Renee stopped by less frequently after the autumn, not because anything had been said, but because something had shifted between them in the way that things shift when people tell each other the truth about small failures and move past them. When she did come by, she came without a pretext. She came with actual coffee, and she stayed for the actual length of time. She meant to stay, and she looked at the workshop with something other than calculation. It was a small change. It was the right one. The violin went on display at the Harrington collection the following spring. Thomas drove to New York with Aaron on a Saturday morning. Aaron wore his good jacket, the one he bought for college interviews, and complained about it for 40 minutes of the drive, and then stopped complaining once they arrived, which Thomas had expected. The gallery was smaller than Thomas had imagined it, and better lit. The violin was in a case in the center of the room, suspended at a slight angle so that both the top and back were visible. The lighting had been calibrated to bring out the figure in the maple, and it looked, in that room, nothing like the thing he had unwrapped from a cloth in a bad-lit dining room for $60. The placard on the wall beside it described the maker and the period, and the construction. It described the arching in plain language, what made it unusual, why it mattered, what it had influenced. It noted where the violin had been found and by whom. At the bottom of the placard, below the technical information, there were 2 sentences that Thomas read slowly. The first said that the violin had been played once before its acquisition, in a repair workshop in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, by the man who found it. The second said, The person he most wanted to hear it was not there. He played it anyway. Some things are worth doing even when the person you do them for is gone. Aaron read the placard beside him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's good, Dad." Thomas nodded. He looked at the violin in its case, at the figure in the maple under the careful light, at the arching that a man in Mittenwald had spent weeks getting exactly right, more than 250 years ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the belief that the thing you make should be as true as you can make it. "Yeah," he said, "it is." On the drive home, Aaron fell asleep in the passenger seat somewhere around the Delaware water gap, his head against the window, his good jacket folded under his arm. Thomas drove in the quiet with the radio low. He thought about $60 in paper bags and the particular quality of light in a garage on a Monday night in October. He thought about what Aaron had said at the kitchen table. "It's just a thing, Dad. It's not her." It was never her. He knew that. He had known it. But sometimes knowing something and being able to carry it without weight are two different things, and the distance between them is the whole work of a life. He drove on. The highway was open ahead of him, and the evening was coming in from the east, and he thought, with something that was not quite happiness but was in the neighborhood of it, that Carol would have liked the placard. She would have pointed to the last two sentences and looked at him with the expression she had used when something was exactly right. She would not have said anything. She wouldn't have needed to. The lights of the valley came up below them as they came over the ridge, and Aaron slept on beside him, and Thomas Greer drove them home.